So I have a question for us as we get going this morning. Have you ever found that you've been doing something and then realize you don't remember why you started doing it that way? You know, you've been doing something for so long that you can't remember why you actually do it that way. There's a story told of a mother and her daughter who are cooking a pot roast for a big family meal. And when they get ready to cook the pot roast, the mother chops off the ends of the pot roast and sets them aside before putting it in the oven. And so the little girl says, Mom, why do you chop off the ends of the pot roast before putting it in the oven? And the mother says, well, that's just the way we've always done it. And the little girl, as little kids often do, says, but why? And the mom says, well, you know, that's actually the way Grandma always did it. And so that's just the way that I do it. And so the little girl goes and finds Grandma and goes, Grandma, why did you chop off the ends of the pot roast before putting it in the oven? And Grandma says, well, you see, in our old house, we had a tiny oven, and so the pot roast wouldn't fit. So we had to cut it off. Right? But I think so often, especially for us within spiritual practices, we've been doing things for so long and in a certain way that sometimes we forget why we've been doing them that way in the first place. And that's what we're kind of getting into this morning. Jesus is going to come head to head this morning with a group known as the Pharisees. And you see, the Pharisees were these great religious teachers, and their name actually means the separate ones. And what they were separate about was the fact that they had such a righteous interpretation and strict observance of the law. The law was everything to them. The way of doing things was everything to them. In fact, their way of doing things had really become their God. They were so desperate to please him, they had lost sight of who he actually is. And so this morning, Jesus has got some questions for these guys about why they've been doing some of these practices. And those questions reflect on us as well. Why do we do some of these spiritual practices, or why do we not do them? And so join me this morning. We're starting in Mark chapter 2. So we're at the beginning of Mark's gospel still. Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 18. So Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 18. And stick with me a little bit this morning because we are going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of some of these topics because it's kind of important to see where they came from. So we'll start in verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Do you sense the condescension here in their words? Right? They've started to see Jesus begin his ministry, right? He's just at the start of his ministry. He's rising in fame and popularity, and he's starting to do all of these things. And so people come to him and they say, well, you look like a religious leader. Why aren't you acting like one? Why don't you fast like all of the other religious and holy people fast? And the interesting piece of this is that if you look in the Old Testament, God actually only asks the Israelite people to fast once a year on Yom Kippur. But the Pharisees and others were trying so desperately again to earn God's favor that they were fasting twice a week, thinking that that would make them more holy. And so they were accusing Jesus and his disciples not of breaking God's law, but of not following their way of doing things. I think we can sometimes fall into this same thing, especially when it comes to our practices. Well, I read my Bible more than they do, or I come to church every Sunday and they don't, or I don't remember the last time I saw them at Bible study, or did you see what they were wearing last Sunday to church? Right? And we hold people to our standards of what Christianity should look like instead of to God's rule and standards. And so Jesus has an answer for them. Verse 19. Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and on that day they will fast." So Jesus tells them essentially that there are appropriate days to fast and appropriate days and times not to fast. And so the question then becomes for us, what are the appropriate days and times to be fasting? Because he's saying that eventually his disciples will fast. So this is apparently something that's going to continue even after Jesus is gone. But maybe for most of us, we're kind of like, I don't really understand or know what this whole fasting thing is. And because we really don't understand it, we don't tend to do it at all, right? You see, fasting was actually a part of the Christian tradition all the way up until about the last 100 years. It's only been in the last 100 years or so that it's really kind of slipped away from the Christian tradition. Because it was this expression that they believed that the body was just as spiritual as the mind was. And so if we were going to do something as a spiritual act, it needed to involve the whole body. And so they would set food aside for a determined period of time. But I think most of us have a general idea of fasting as well. It's something kind of trendy, right, in today's new dieting systems, right? We kind of fast intermittent, here or there. Or maybe you've heard of people giving things up or fasting for Lent. And that's kind of your basic understanding of what fasting is. But I want to argue this point for you this morning, that within the scriptures, fasting was not a way to show God just how righteous you are and to earn something from him. In fact, more often than not, the encounter with God happened first, and then they would fast. So it's reverse from what most of our basic understandings are. And as I did some research for this morning, because that was really kind of my basic understanding even before some of this. As I did some research, I found a scholar that I really agree with, and I think he orchestrates fasting in a good light for us to see. And so he puts them in kind of three baskets, these events of fasting, and we're going to throw them up on the screen here. And we're going to walk through these three types of fasting so we can kind of see if this is a practice maybe we should be considering. And so the first type of fasting is a defining moments fast. This is when something so stark happens in your life, good or bad, that it's a defining moment for you. And so as a recognition of that moment and remembering our dependence upon God for whatever has happened, we would stop and mark that moment with a fast by giving up our daily practice of eating to be focused on who God is and what he's just done in whatever the defining moment is for us and the way that it has changed our lives. And then there's a turning from our sinful choices fast. And in fact, this is actually the bucket where most of the occurrences of fasting within the Bible fall. They kind of fall within this turning from our sinful choices thing. And this is the idea that when we've done something wrong or when we've sinned, we would fast as a stark contrast to say that was not a good way of doing things, and so I want to turn my life and go in a new direction. And so to make that a really stark moment and to define it for ourselves, we will give up food for a time being as a marker of that, and that our hunger would remind us that that's not the way and things that we were supposed to go. And when we are hungry, it would force us to think more about God. But look, in this idea of a turning from sin fast, this is not a punishment. It's not a punishment. What it is it's a reminder, it's a grieving of the old way of doing things, and that we thought that that old way was okay, and a turning to something new. Again, with the idea that our whole bodies are spiritual and not just our minds. And then we have a final type of fasting. And this is also a place where a lot of the scriptural references to fasting fall into. And it's this idea of a tragic calamities fast. This is the idea that something so horrible, suffering or tragedy so great has happened to us, someone in our lives, or somewhere in the world, that the only appropriate response is to stop all of our usual activities and to mark that moment. Because within the scriptures, death and suffering are a great diversion from God's intended plan. So they wanted to mark that moment. They believed that we should grieve again in our whole bodies, which I actually don't think we do very well, especially here in the West. When we kind of have funerals, we do this kind of quick, one-off, 1 day, 1 hour, be done with it, and move on sort of a thing. But they understood that we needed to mark that moment of grief, that it was okay to mourn the loss of a loved one, and to do so in a stark way and with great reminder. You see, we don't reject the idea that there is a resurrection, right? We have hope in the resurrection. But even still, we mourn the earthly loss, and it's okay to do so. Even still, we mourn the suffering that isn't supposed to be there, and it's okay to do so. In fact, Jesus says that it's okay to do so. Remember in verse 20, he says that when he's taken away from them, they will fast. He says they will mourn the fact that I'm no longer with them. And that's a good moment for them to do so. And so, what about us? Is this still a good practice for us? I would argue absolutely. It's not something we typically do, but it's a way and a time to set aside a moment and to reflect with our whole bodies about what has happened. And again, as we experience that hunger, that the hunger would point us to God. When you feel that hunger, you would go, oh yes, God is the one with me. He's the one that sustains me. He's the one that keeps me going. And so then what about the moments that aren't so serious or so grievous? What do we do in those moments? Well, in those moments we don't fast, but we feast. Right? Jesus says, in fact, in verse 19, just prior to that how could his disciples fast now because the bridegroom is with them? He's here. His grace and mercy and love and compassion is here. That's a time of feasting and celebration. And you see, we live in this kind of in-between state, right? In the already but not yet. Right? In this moment where we both know what Jesus has done, but also know that it's not quite complete yet. And so there are still moments and times in our lives that we might give something up. In fact, that's why a lot of people do so over the season of Lent. They give something up, and in the reminder of giving that up, they're reminded that we are still in our sin and that Jesus had to die for that, and mourning the fact that Jesus had to die. But then we feast on Easter Sunday in the reminder that we are forgiven, that we are made new again. All right. Looks like I've still got most of you with us as we've kind of gone through the weeds here. Good. All right, so what is Jesus going to next? Well, he kind of seems to switch gears here. So let's see what's going on. Verse 21. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the skin will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wineskins. Okay, all right. So we were talking about fasting, and now we're talking about holes in my jeans and what we do with wine. What is going on here? What's Jesus doing? What's he getting at here? Well, Jesus is using two different kind of parables here to get us to see the bigger picture behind some of these practices. You see, in modern culture, at least a couple of years ago, I think the trend is kind of going away, right? It used to be really popular to actually buy jeans with holes in them, right? I mean, people would pay extra money to get jeans with holes in them, right? Well, there was a time before that we didn't, it was, good not to have holes in them, and people thought, you didn't have enough money if you had holes in your jeans, right? So you didn't have good clothes. And so people would patch their clothing if they had holes in it. But most of us know that when you wash clothing, right, it tends to shrink. And so if you put an unshrunken piece of cloth on an already shrunken piece of clothing, when the new fabric shrinks, it rips away from the old fabric, right? And so what Jesus is saying here is, he says, look, you don't need a Jesus patch. You can't just add me in to your old way of doing things and thinking it's going to be okay. You can't just go about oh, Lord, I'm doing all of these good things for you, and I'm trying my hardest, and if you would just give me a couple of Jesus patches, then I'd be okay. No, he says, you don't need a patch. You need a whole new garment. And I've come to give it to you. And the same thing is true with the parable of the wineskins. Maybe this one we understand a little bit too, because we're not far from wine country, and so maybe we laugh just like the people in this story certainly would have laughed when Jesus insinuated that they should put new wine in old wineskins. Because wine, when it ferments, it releases gases. And leather, leather only stretches to so far. And so eventually, if you put new wine into an already stretched patch of leather, it would burst, and you would ruin both the container and the new wine that you put in it. And that's what Jesus is saying. He says, you can't just pour a little bit of me into your old way of life. It's about a new way of life, a new way of doing things. He's trying to help the Pharisees, trying to help us see that our practices don't earn our way to God with just a little bit of His grace added on top. But the Pharisees really don't seem to understand this very well. In fact, our scripture jumps ahead in the next verse a couple of weeks, and they come back to him with more questions for him. Verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" So Jesus and his disciples are just having a lovely stroll on a Sabbath Sunday when the Pharisees come up to him and are like, "What in the world are they doing? They're plucking heads of grain and eating it on the Sabbath day." But again, if we look at the Old Testament, more than likely the disciples were walking along the edge of a field, and the Old Testament says that the edges of the fields were meant for those in need and the travelers. See, as a farmer, you could harvest the inside of your field, but you couldn't harvest the outside of your field. The outside was left for the travelers and the needy. And so Jesus' disciples, they aren't doing anything wrong. And so why do the Pharisees seem to have their panties in such a wad? Like, what is going on here? Right? But it's probably not what they were doing, right? But on the day they were doing it. If you remember from a couple of weeks ago, the Pharisees are very strict about the following of the Sabbath day and what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, right? Because God says, you shall not work at all on the Sabbath day so that you can keep it holy. And so they had built all of these rules and regulations around what work was, right? And so the disciples, by simply plucking a head of grain and rubbing it between their hands to get the shell off, they were harvesting. And that was work. And you can't work on the Sabbath day. But they had lost sight of what the Sabbath day actually was meant for. They were so consumed by following all these rules and laws about the Sabbath and worried about making it unholy that they made it a burden to themselves instead. But it's kind of interesting because Jesus doesn't seem to answer their question when he responds to them. He tells them a story instead. Take a look at verse 25. He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." I really love the way that Jesus opens this section here, because he says, "Have you ever read?" Remember who he's talking to. He's talking to the Pharisees. Now, these were guys who had the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible memorized. They've read this passage, right? It's kind of like trying to tell Michael Jordan how to shoot a basketball, right? I think he knows. And so, what is Jesus getting at here? I think he's picking at their pride and saying, you seem to know the scriptures so well, but do you really know them and understand them? Do you really understand how to apply them to your life? But so then why this story of King David? Well, Jesus is putting himself in the place of David in this moment, in the place of the unrecognized king of Israel. You see, at the time of this story where David goes into the temple, David has been anointed king, but he isn't actually king over Israel yet. King Saul is still king in the eyes of the people over Israel at this point. And Saul is trying to kill David. And so David and his companions are fleeing for their lives. And they run into the temple because they're hungry and ask the priest if there's anything to eat for them. And the priest says, well, the only thing here is the bread of the presence, which was 12 loaves of bread set out for God each week. And the only person who's able to eat that bread is the priest. And so, well, the priest actually gives them the bread to eat. And Jesus says, well, you don't criticize David for having eaten the bread when he was in need, because he was king. But you would criticize me? Do you know who I am? In fact, he will lay it on a little thicker as they continue. Verse 27. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So Jesus says, not only was David the unrecognized king, but so am I the unrecognized king of Israel. But not only am I king, I'm Lord even of the Sabbath. And at this point, it's not mentioned in the scriptures, but at this point the Pharisees would have lost their minds. Because the only one who is Lord of the Sabbath is God. And so Jesus is claiming to be God. But we'll get back to that title here in just a moment. Because to realize what it really means that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, I think we also need to talk a little bit about what is the Sabbath. Because again, I think we have this general understanding of maybe what the Sabbath is and how we're supposed to celebrate or do this day of rest. But do we really understand it? And if you've never heard or watched any of the videos from the Bible Project, these guys have some great resources out there for you on some of these basic topics. And as we dive in, they had some good information for us this morning as well in this topic of the Sabbath. You see, the Sabbath actually started in creation, back in Genesis chapter 1. You see, God creates the whole world in 6 days, right? And he marks each of those days and says that there was evening and there was morning on each of these days. But then, on the seventh day, God does something different. He ceases from his work and he rests. And that phrase, that there is evening and there is morning, doesn't appear on the seventh day. It's an implication that the seventh day rest is supposed to extend into eternity. And so we were supposed to be people who ruled and reigned on this world with God in the seventh day rest of life. But our sin got in the way, and we brought pain and turmoil and struggle into the world that was meant for rest. But God says, it's okay. One day I will bring someone who will bring again my ultimate rest. And then he gives the Israelite people a glimpse at this ultimate rest. You see, the Israelite people were slaves in Egypt, and God brought them up out of Egypt and into the promised land. And as he did so, they had to go through the wilderness before getting to the promised land. But God says to them, I want you to live in the wilderness like you're already in the promised land. And he invites us to do the same thing. To live in our wilderness like we are already in the promised land. And they eventually get to the promised land. And then they fall away from God again. And darkness is back again. And in the midst of this darkness, Jesus shows up. And there's something kind of interesting we mentioned when we started this series in Mark. And Jesus begins his ministry on the Sabbath day. And he reads from the scroll of Isaiah and says, I have come to set the captives free and to declare the year of Jubilee. You see, the Sabbath day was supposed to be a remembrance about the ultimate day of rest. Because the Israelite people had been working in slavery for so long, they needed to have a reminder to take a day of rest. You can't work every day of the week. It's okay to rest. Which is probably a pretty good reminder for us as well, as we tend to live in a society of workaholism. You need a day of rest. And that's what the day of Sabbath was supposed to do. God says, take a whole day and live like you're already in the promised land. That's what the day of rest, the day of Sabbath was supposed to be. A day of reflecting and living like we're already in the promised land. And then the Old Testament goes further, because God doesn't just set up the Sabbath day. Every year, there were 7 other festivals that were supposed to be reminders of the Sabbath rest and eternal rest that was coming. And then every 7 years, there was a year where they would let the whole land rest for an entire year. They wouldn't farm it, nothing. They let the whole thing rest for an entire year. And if anybody had any debts, they were to be forgiven. And then, every 7 times 7 years was the year of Jubilee. And this was supposed to be the greatest of all remembrances about the day of rest and the day of Sabbath. And on this year, if you had lost your land or had become a slave or any of that kind of stuff, it was all washed away. It was all clean, and you were given back your land and everything that you had lost. They're all reminders of us of the greater rest that is to come. And so when Jesus says, I am Lord of the Sabbath, he says, I have come to bring that ultimate rest. I am the Sabbath, he says. In fact, he says even this, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. But you see, the Pharisees, they had turned the Sabbath again into this day of chores, a day of making sure that they were following all of the laws so that God would accept them. Instead of the Sabbath being for them as a day to take a breath and to relax and to reflect upon what God had done for them, they had made it all about what they needed to do for God. Oh, may we not do that ourselves, because it's all too easy. You see, for us, the Sabbath is still supposed to be a day where we reflect on the eternal rest and live now as if the eternal rest has already come. But the interesting thing is that Jesus never says that Sunday will be the new Sabbath day. In fact, nowhere in the scriptures does it say Sunday is the new Sabbath day. No, we were now supposed to start living as people of Sabbath rest. To certainly take those days and to find those times to reflect completely, but it wasn't meant to be a burden. It wasn't meant to have to be a specific day every week for us. But instead, again, a reminder of who He is and what He has done for us. Because part of this idea of Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath is that He can forgive our sins. Because you see, I don't know about you, but when I've sinned and I've kind of got that guilt and that weight and that, it just kind of bogs you down, doesn't it? You just know that wasn't a good thing. We need to turn and do something else. It's kind of hard to rest when you have that weight on your shoulders. And there are all these products and things and stuff, right, that the world offers us to help us find rest, right? But none of that stuff grants us rest from the darkness that's in our lives or that's in the world. Only Christ can do that. Only He can offer you that rest. And in fact, He offers you that rest this morning. You are forgiven. Rest in Him. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. You are not. You see, it's all too easy for us as we think about these practices of fasting or feasting or Sabbath day to make rules and laws out of them. But when Jesus came, He didn't come swinging around the law to hit people with it. No, we heard last week that He came and He ate with the sinners and the tax collectors. He feasted with them. He celebrated with them. And so we're now called to be people who live in that rest. As forgiven and set free, we can choose to do those things. We can feel free to fast and to mourn the things that happen in our lives as a whole body reminder that this is not the way things are supposed to be as we long for that eternal rest. And we can also choose to feast on those Sabbath days with friends and with family, in joy and remembrance of what is to come for all who would believe and trust in him. May we rest in that and not in our own strength or some practice we feel like we need to come together with. Amen.